with a low level of warfare, so to speak. Many years ago, Christian de Pertuis, myself, we kind of discussed about this. It didn't catch a lot of traction. We ended up on the MSR. Then this paper came out with Artur and Otmar, and I thought it was a great opportunity to have this discussion because it's a necessary discussion. So it is an informal conversation. It is not something that is going to happen now. It's not something that will happen under this commission, but it's something that we hope will inspire the European institution to further discussion and examination of the idea. In what form we can see and what governance we can see. The way we will run this today will be, I will make a few remarks very quick. My role here is not to accompany the discussion, but to help it along. With a keynote for Ottmar Edenhofer, who is very well known to you from the Potsdam Institute, but also the chair of the Climate Scientific Advisory Committee, Artur Runge-Metzger. I don't think Artur requires a lot of intervention. As somebody that I have known for many years, from the COP to the EU and the EU to the COP. And then we invited a number of participants, all of them very well known. Great pleasure to have with us Jos Delbeke, and it's been an inspiration to me for many years in this position, a former DG, and now also in his academic role. And frankly, this whole conversation came also from the meeting that you have in Florence, a wonderful week that we had there, just not only because of Florence, but because the meeting was very, very helpful. And then Ingo Ramming, also, I wouldn't call it a veteran, but somebody who's been around for a long time, former Commerce Bank, currently BBVA. Luca Taschini, University of Edinburgh Business School and Grantham Research Institute, Masque Ferdinand with it, and then Wilfried Rickels from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Again, people that we have tried to have a variety of views that will kind of present the discussion from different angles, and hopefully this is a discussion that starts now. I'm sure it will happen in other fora, but at least we want to make our contribution. Now, I will say my few bullets. I'm not Jos Delbeke, so I don't have 5 bullets, but I will say that the EU and the EU ETS has had over the years, it's something that we love to hate and that we can't stay away to discuss, but it has both evolutionary and revolutionary moments. The evolutionary moment has come with every review. There have been a few revolutionary moments, at least in my mind. The MSR has been one of those disruptive moments. The CBAM is another disruptive moment. All of them, both of them have required a significant amount of socializing, debate, discussion to come to this current format. We are now entering a new phase. Maybe that phase is not obvious, but it is, as my Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would say, it is 2024 almost, and we are going to see a different world as we reach toward the 2030s and the 2020s, the beginning of 2030s, with a decreasing liquidity by 2039, probably with no liquidity. If it's 2039, then the market is going to time that out, as Marcus will tell us, and Ingo, but I think that the market will time that out before 2039. We're going to see that. But also the net zero. And the net zero requires negative emissions, and something that we need to understand how we're going to manage the entering of this important thing into the market. The EU has commissioned work regarding post-2030 ETS and its role. So that implies that a debate is taking place, a debate will take place. So the discussion of how to manage this transition, how to manage the market, has to manage another disruptive moment in the 30s, and that has brought in the EU central carbon bank. Now, this can be taken many forms. There's many remits that central banks have. The EUAs have been seen by many as a currency, as a very strategic currency. And some people would see a broader remit, that of managing the market. Others will see a remit related very much to removal and how to manage removals. The game is over, the game is open, and I'm not here to direct the discussion. I think we're here to listen and learn and take us from here. So I will give first the floor to Otmar and Artur. And please, you have the floor, gentlemen. We're very keen to listen to you and the idea that you bring to this debate through your paper and others. So now, Juan, will you share the screen, please? Go.
Can you see them?
Are you gentlemen seeing this? Everybody
Yes,
see this?
wonderful. If you could put it in the presentation mode, that would be fantastic.
We are. It is in the
presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
So the first slide. So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about this important issue. The next slide, please. And also the next slide. Now, we basically did something on the next slide, please. So we basically tried to understand the role of CDR in a broader context, and in particular, two forms of CDR, carbon dioxide removals, the permanent one and the non-permanent one. So we think this is quite important. The role of the permanent removals is that you can afford a much more ambitious target. The role of the non-permanent removals is, to a certain extent, to make the transition path a little bit smoother. So in economic terms, you could say the non-permanent CDRs allows you some kind of consumption smoothing. So if you look at in a broader context, so there is one fundamental distinction to be made here. The one is emissions have to be priced. So this is what we call in this first paper, Pigu's advice. You have to price emissions caused by burning coal, oil, and gas and by land use change. But on the other hand, when basically somebody will provide carbon sinks, so this deserves a payment. So pricing emissions and paying for the carbon sinks are the two sides of the same coin. If you have to deal with non-permanent removals, so then of course you have to discount this, and this is what we call here the Sisyphus warning, because as soon as you introduce non-permanent removals, so this has to be renewed all the time. Now, in the second paper on the governance of the carbon dioxide removal, we want to be a little bit more specific, and in particular, we focused on the institutional structure of the European Union. And the next slide, please. So, and we came up with a way forward for the governance, where we think that we need a carbon removal certification authority just for monitoring, then also a Green Leap Innovation Authority. I will say a few words about this, but at the center and the core of our institutional proposals is the European Carbon Central Bank. Now, the question is, what kind of mandate should this European Carbon Central Bank have? And how can we deal with that in an appropriate way? So let us highlight the three steps which we are in. The first step is just emission reduction. And emission reduction is decisive. But then there will be very likely residual emissions in the system by 2039, something like this. And these residual emissions have to be compensated. The European Carbon Central Bank or the European Commission has to stabilize the expectations around this issue, because otherwise there's a high risk the market becomes illiquid, the emissions trading market becomes illiquid, and prices are increasing too rapidly, which distorts the whole process. So we need removals for compensating the residual emissions. So this will lead us then to net zero. But in order to basically to compensate some kind of overshoot, we need net negative. So this is another institutional feature which is absolutely essential. That at some stage we need net negative emissions, and the whole structure should be discussed along this way. And we have identified in this paper the following institutional features which we need. The next slide, please. First, procurement and funding. We need reverse auctions and targeted subsidies, in particular for the new technologies. Reverse auction of the new technologies is one way to do this. But this is only the first step. The second aspect is liability. When we have to deal with non-permanent CDRs, so we create a carbon debt. And seemingly cheap land-based removals can become very expensive when this carbon debt is taken into account properly. And this is quite important, because if this is ignored, so the land-based solutions, the nature-based solution might be underestimated in their costs. Moral hazard is involved. Firms might have an incentive to go strategically bankrupt to avoid excessive carbon debt. This is a cost for society. And here we need a lender of last resort. So this is the liability issue. But then there is also managing the cap. And managing the cap is a very complicated aspect and a very delicate aspect. And again, this is not just to compensate for the residual emissions, this is also to create net negative. And here we think that the European Carbon Central Bank should issue overshoot permits. The overshoot permits can be auctioned in the market by the central bank, has to be by the firms in the market. So they get the permission for an overshoot, but then they have the obligation to reduce the emissions in the later stage. And with that, we can also finance the net negative emissions. Of course, this is a commitment issue, and the European Carbon Central Bank has to back this by the procurement and funding of new new technologies. Then there is this issue of the price conversions. At the very beginning, when we define an own CDR target, of course, there will be a price gap between the compliance market and the CDR subsidies. And over time, probably we need a price convergence, because without the price convergence, it might be very complicated to achieve efficiency. And efficiency seems to me in the long run is an important aspect. And then the last thing is institutional cooperation. So build technology expertise and ensure funding. So this is the link to the Green Leap Innovation Authority, which basically can set priorities at the very beginning of the research process. So this is, roughly speaking, the mandate of the European Carbon Central Bank in order to compensate residual emissions, but also to ensure net negative emissions. And with that, I stop and hand over to Arthur.
Arthur?
Yes, I think I have very little to add to Ottmar's introduction. I think almost everything has been said. Just maybe to amplify a little bit the whole issue of liability, and maybe reminding ourselves that at a certain point in time, we tried to get the certified emission reductions under the CDM working in the European Union. And there was a keen interest by the market also to have a link to non-permanent CERs, the so-called temporary long-term CERs. And when we were thinking of this with Joss at the time, whether that would be possible, we stumbled over the liability issue. Because it's very clear that if you have non-temporary, non-permanent emission reductions or removals, that, as Ottmar was saying, companies could just run away and no longer replace. They would make a big buck, but the overall system would be undermined and the public would have to carry the bill. And we worked on that proposal at the time, and the lender of last resort was told to be the finance ministers. And I think you can imagine how well this was received by member states at the time. And therefore, we never made use of that possibility. That was granted under the Kyoto Protocol, but we just could not make it work under the emissions trading system. Now I think the stakes are much higher in the future, as Ottmar has said. It's not only about compensating, but it's also about cleaning up the atmosphere. And that, I believe very firmly, if we want to get to an efficient solution, we should also make use of non-permanent solutions. So the governance proposal is there in order to allow for that happening in the medium to long term. And it's important that we start now thinking of that, because generating carbon dioxide removals, even in the land use sector, is not something that is happening overnight. It takes time planning and a predictable time horizon for those who are working in the farming and also in the forestry sector. I think with that amplification at the end, I think we can move to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Artur. So, first of all, thank you both of you for a wonderful introduction to the subject. We're looking at permanent and non-permanent and maybe different roles for a central bank, and the whole array of remits that you see, and institutional arrangement that can take place. I have to also confess to you that there are some that have been talking about something like this also about at the more international global level, and my expectation is that may not emerge right away, but that discussion will certainly continue and be amplified, even though it's probably, even if it's difficult to do at the European level, you can imagine how complicated it would be to do at a global level. Let me go first to Ingo Raming. Ingo, why don't you start, and then Josh, you come right after that.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for the presentations on this topic, focusing very much on the removal topic. I mean, let me start first with the European Central Bank idea around that, because that was, let's say, part of what took my attention on that. And let me start with what are the issues that I see at the moment with regard to the EU ETS in general. So clearly the structure of the EU ETS will change fundamentally over the next 18 years or 15 years until 2038, when most likely we'll reach the cap at zero. And one of the main changes is that the system will move from a very power-centric system to a, let's say, more industrial transport kind of system. And that will, of course, generate significant challenges. And with that, we will have the issue, of course, that possibly it's not only the stick anymore that we need for the EU ETS, but as well a carrot. We have seen it in the US with the IRA. We see in Europe the discussions about CCFDs around that. And of course, besides, let's call it subsidizing industrial reductions, removals on that side, possibly a broader range will be required, as mentioned before, with regard to removals. The second point is that, let's say, if we talk about the European Central Bank or European Bank, which sounds a little bit less narrow-minded on the central on this side, we had obviously this discussion before, and there was always the concern about trust with regard to, let's call it the European Central Bank and carbon markets around that, and how can we achieve this kind of long-term focus on removals, on methods. The liability point that you raised is, of course, a very important point. And how can we avoid this kind of short-termism that sometimes comes up on that side? And then, of course, with regards to, let's say, phase 5 of the EU ETS, one on this side, how can we make it bigger? Because clearly, let's say the cap will go to zero around 2038. And for that, we need more linking to have a liquid market as a first step, possibly with regards to the EU ETS 2, but then possibly broader and creating something like a more global market around ITMOS and so on. And of course, as we will not get to zero emissions, we need the removals. And in this context, of course, the points that were mentioned about reliability, about funding mechanisms are, of course, very important. The question is it more an EIB-like funding mechanism that can take as well some liability, or do we need a carbon bank for this case? As especially from a market perspective, sometimes norms like central bank obviously creates concerns that, let's say, that would then be driven more about, let's say, political short-term interventions and less the strategic goals that, of course, were clearly outlined by the previous speaker from that perspective. So from that perspective, to sum it up, clearly the idea is important because we will need this change. We will clearly need to address the topic of removals in Europe, but much better if we can address it globally. The liability issue is an important point, but the question is, do we need a new institution for that? Especially something that is normed with a central bank kind of norm around it, or are existing, let's say, existing like the EIB, similarly available to guarantee this kind of strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh.
Thank you. Thank you.
You don't have your hat of DG anymore with that tour kind of running this debate from an official point of view. There are no more sacred cows.
Yeah, exactly.
There were sacred cows.
Exactly, and happy to discuss or to be participant in this discussion, which I think is a very important one, because as Ingo was alluding to, we are at a very important point where we no longer have the ETS as it stands, apart from the phasing out of the EU allowances as we know them by 2039, etc., but also basically a shift of interest from the price effect as well as to the revenue effect, which is very new because prices were historically very low. Prices are now very important, and they generate a lot of revenue, at least for the next decade. So I would rather bring back also part of the debate that you have been presenting, and I fully subscribe to what Otmar and Arthur have been describing on the importance of removals. But removals are, a longer way off, unfortunately, compared to where we are now. So when I focus on the debate between price and revenues, I also will make a plea to debate the shorter term, the next 5 to 10 years, and through that prepare the longer term, which is the net negative, to which I fully subscribe to what Otmar was indicating. But, the policy debate is always the short term and how we move from the short term to the long term. Second point that I want to make is what Otmar was describing as the functions of a possible central bank. That is the core question, the functions, not so much the mandate or the institutional setting, but the functions. And the core of the function is the management of the cap. Of course, we can have all kinds of discussions about liability, about how we subsidize or reinforce or additionally incentivize the removals, or we can have exchange rates or whatever. But the core issue is the management of the cap, which makes the link to the long-term objective of 2050, but also beyond, which is the net negative. And in that respect, I would also try to build in a somewhat shorter-term dimension. The removals, important work to be done. It must be done as fast as we can, but it will take some time. So for that reason, I also would like to build in that international dimension that was mentioned by Ingo and by you, Andre, at the beginning, which I think is, should we not reconsider the openness of the EU ETS to foreign credits? The question on Article 6.2, 6.4 because we are all moving towards an industrial strategy, a fundamentally reviewed industrial strategy, the post-war or the reality of the war in Ukraine and what is going to happen beyond that, with Russia disappearing and cheap and abundant natural gas disappearing from the radar screen. How is Europe going to work it out? And I would put these removals not as an open access to the EU ETS as we had in the past, but a very partial and selective access that could possibly reinforce the industrial strategy that we need in the future, not least in the field of energy, but also in terms of low carbon industry. We cannot just import everything from other parts of the world. So that would be my second point, management of the cap, but perhaps also with a rather move in the short term related to some kind of international selective, it should be selective, but an openness to some credits coming from elsewhere. And my last point I would like to make is what you in your paper, Andre, are opening up as the institutional framing of a European carbon bank or central carbon bank, which we need. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. We absolutely need a kind of overview according to the functions that Otmar is indicating, but the assertion that we need a possible treaty change for that, I think, is a step far too way off from where we are today. If there was to be a treaty change in the discussion for all kinds of other reasons, we should join that debate. But let's not reverse it. If there is not a treaty change in the making, we can wait a long time for having a treaty change in view of a European Central Carbon Bank. So I think, should rather continue to focus on the functions, and the functions related to the management of the cap. And to some extent, in the current ETS, we have an opening for that, which is not very operational. That's Article 29A. It is, designed by the legislator in order never to use it, to make it as a kind of, impossible way to manage the cap. But we will have in the coming, 5 years another review of the ETS. Perhaps we can start a reflection on how to operationalize Article 29A in view of the functions that Otmar was outlining, which all turn around the management of the cap. And I think the convergence issue that Otmar was indicating is a very important one, removals versus vis-a-vis the ETS 1, but the ETS 1 and the ETS 2 also is subject of a convergence issue that also may want to be managed one way or the other. And that could be, in my view, as part of an ETS review, not necessarily as part of a major institutional review, as is mentioned in the treaty change. If I even would be a little bit more provocative, if we link up the idea of a European Central Carbon Bank to the idea of treaty change, the idea may be dead in the water. So let's concentrate on the functions, on what a next ETS review may contain in the way of operationalizing the management of the cap, in a well thought through manner. And that was not ready in the last ETS review. That was, there were many other concerns, the ETS 2 and whatever. So that was the past ETS change. Now, the coming ETS review should be well thought through and focusing on the functions that a possible future European Central Bank could take on, whatever the name is. It could be a name of an agency or whatever. So that would be, in my view, the most operational way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jos. Interesting that you picked on that particular provocative statement. It was meant to provoke. But as I was in a meeting in the BDI in Berlin last week, and at that time, what I said is that changing, making the transition based on treaty change is probably illusionary. So I think that we better get on and do the business rather than hope for some other things to the rescue. Even though the governance in general of Europe and the US are not similar, and they will not change to accommodate this. So I think we better get used to that idea. Luca, you're next, and then Marcus.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot. I would like to follow up on Josh's point about how to operationalize one of the key feature, one of the key probably objective of whatever type of institutions we might think of, that is the management of a cap, that I think is extremely important. And I would like to do that precisely addressing Ingo's question: do we really need a new institution to do that? Now, I don't want to start making any sort of recollection of the genesis of the EU ETS, but definitely we've been discussing the MSR because we were coming from a situation where any sort of cap was decided and was fixed and constant. So it was decided to be at a certain level through political debate and accommodating certain needs and state circumstances. And eventually we move towards a system that is slightly more responsive, as exactly Otmar was suggesting, is now a system where we price emissions, but we probably need to ensure that those emissions are actually priced at an appropriate price, meaning that they do reflect the real social cost of emission. So within this context, I believe that at the moment, again, going back to the point that Josh was making, operationalize the management of the cap. At the moment, we have an MSR. The MSR delivered the outcome of a price that is now responding a little bit more to certain economic circumstances. The key question is whether the current setup of the MSR, that is, by the way, a rule-based mechanism, so there's no discretionary whatsoever in that, and that I think is key and important. So again, going back to Ingo's point, do we need a new institution, or can we use rule-based? Is the level at which the MSR or any evolution of the Article 29 is sufficiently speedy, is sufficiently effective? So I think that this is really the key questions. You might design, and I've been seeing papers that come up with these very sophisticated, I would say, smart carbon pricing. So you have basically an evolution that you and Andrea, you mentioned we've been through evolution and revolutions. So it will be probably a potentially much more a new evolution of the MSR, where is the thresholds, the withdrawal or injection rates are a little bit more responsive. But I think the key question here is, do we prefer rule-based, very, again, comprehensive mechanism, or are we better off using a discretionary institution? And I'm very, at the moment, I don't have a strong opinion nor evidence of a preference for one or the other. So I'm very keen to hear everyone's opinion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Luca. Marcus?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great introduction and the invite here, and also the views shared so far. So I'm trying to give some answer to Luca's question, maybe. Even though I'm also still a bit doubtful that we have assessed all the evidence. But we talked about the ETS review being in place and net emissions basically required to go down to zero by 2039. So there's two challenges which are arising from this. Liquidity in the ETS will by nature be reduced with such a cap trajectory. And also residual emissions require some negative emissions to balance. I think this is quite clear, and this is what everyone so far has said. So I think we can constitute this as a good basis for this discussion. And then towards 2040, I think a matching number of removals floating the system is required to clear the market during any given year, with residual industry emissions being in place. So yeah, it was then mentioned that a central bank approach could cure both issues. So if I look at liquidity first, I think liquidity in this case here is a function of trust into the system, into the framework, and availability of allowances. So I mean, what we see with recent papers and also talking to market participants, we can see that stakeholders have quite some confidence in the market and its framework as we speak. We have quite a forward-looking attitude in this market, which is reflected by UA's trading between 80 or 90, or between 80 and 90 euros at this point in time, when fundamentals, especially fuel switch levels, at least at the moment, tell probably a different story. So the system is rigged for a forward-looking setup, which in my view is reflected in price and direction for market participants. And in my view, this can be disrupted by creating a kind of an element of perceived randomness, which a central bank approach, I think, would be perceived as by quite a lot of market participants. So a central bank approach, I think, would be seen as determining the appropriate market conditions in terms of price or volume required to clear the market. And I think this is what we can say at this stage. The market has been quite good at and will continue being good at. When it comes to the required inflow of negative emissions with high storage permanence, I think removals will undoubtedly be part of that solution. So to ensure enough supply of removal credits during the post-2030 period, to avoid running towards the cliff that I think Ottmar mentioned at the start, upfront financing of removal projects is key. So for removals to work towards liquidity and residual emission challenge, we need costs to come down. I think this is also quite clear. And front runners in this segment need to be supported. So yeah, I think Andre, you mentioned 2024 as one year. I think 26 is another year which is important in this case, because the European Commission should report how negative emissions could be covered by emission trading. So this is all coinciding also with the 2040 target setting process. But this might be too late for ensuring the ramp up required to cater for the post-2030 demand. So allowing pre-purchasing of carbon removals, as it was described in one of the papers, as a requirement to counterbalance future price risk, is in my view not much different than in effect than a liquid forward market, where you have a physical delivery at contract expiry and where the price is actually getting it there, right? When it comes to the upfront investment part, we do have seen the requirement for upfront investments in quite a few sectors which are currently part of the ETS. So we have the modernization fund, which is built to help the utility sector to continue modernizing and probably also upfront financing some of the projects. And we have the innovation fund, which is more geared towards the industry sector, which I think is gearing up more and more importance to kind of get us towards the net zero road. In my view, we might fast track actually this discussion by amending the innovation fund modalities on how the removal projects can basically apply for funding. It's probably controversial with quite a few member states, but probably less controversial than a central bank approach, and might get us kind of to the required pre-financing a bit quicker. So I think to sum up, it's not the lack of foresight regarding future prices that's the issue in my view, but it's more the lack of foresight regarding the regulatory framework and the eligibility of removal credits within the ETS that causes the perceived problem. So in case the removal credits were to be allowed for compliance purposes in the ETS, a clear incentive was given to developers of such projects to go ahead, price those credits in an ETS context. And there the critical factor is time to solve both the liquidity challenge and the kind of financing of the required negative emissions. So in this case, I, at least at this stage, strongly argue for being pragmatic to kind of see what do we have in terms of institutions. Can we make those stronger or fit for purpose? and combine the strength of the ETS with the use of existing facilities rather than creating a central bank or another facility to get us there.
Thanks, Marcus, and last but not least, Wilfred.
Thank you. I believe thinking about this problem, it helps to remember that we are dealing here with a stock problem and not with a flow problem. So it's very different, the challenge to integrate, for example, renewables into the grid than removal certificates in the EU ETS, and therefore different instruments might be appropriate, for example, something like a carbon central bank. Another issue that you cannot start 25, 26, I would guess, with integrating carbon dioxide removals, because the current EU ETS directive does not allow to include companies which do not have an emitting activity, so which do the opposite. But you could already start early on with procurement of these removals and building up such a reserve, so a carbon removal certificate reserve, which will be then used at some point after 2030 as conditionally supplied to the market. What Luca mentions there is, I think, very important. So I mean, the market stability reserve is, first it will run empty at some point, and it's currently very rule-based organized. All these triggers work by rules, and I'm very skeptical that when a shrinking market, when these sectors which had not so far this high emission reductions have to reduce, where we have much more uncertainty about the abatement costs in the industry, when CBAM means that free allocation ends in 2033, that we can all foresee and organize by rules, which might be better to have an adaptive management where you conditionally supply. And maybe if you do a second round, I would be great to learn what Luca thinks then about volatility in the market, because that's one of our arguments, that a carbon central bank would need a sufficient carbon removal reserve to be considered sufficient long by the market to stabilize it in any way. So it should not necessarily have a fixed strike price, but it should have the mandate to stabilize the market, so that there remains uncertainty for the firm, so that they still have strong incentives to invest in abatement technologies. And this conditional supply also means at some point you might not use all of those certificates, because at some point, and that was very clear by Ottmar, we take or have to take certificates out of the market anyway. So the EU ETS will change from a revenue generating system to a system which costs. And we still have then to decide who distributes these costs. But it means in this phase until 2039, we are in a period of over allocation in a sense, and we are buying some of the certificates we are giving out back. So using these revenues from the allowances we are selling now just keeps the polluter pays principle in place. And in this function, such a carbon central bank, or it could be another institution, could very well address further services. One very important aspect is what Ottmar mentioned is accounting issues, because we will have most likely incoming certificates from the international market under the Article 6.4 mechanism, which are derived under a cost-benefit accounting framework. So, for example, ton-year accounting, which do not necessarily work well in the compliance system as we have. So we have someone to step in to provide the liability to deal with the non-permanence and replace it at some point. So if you have proper liability schemes, I would say non-permanence is not necessarily a problem. We already see that in the effort sharing regulation, where we can bring in LULUCF credits for our targets. Here, the states have the liability, and then non-permanence is not such a big issue. Of course, such a central bank could then also provide portfolio management services, having this different inflow of services. And I think that the challenge would not be restricted to the EU ETS 1. I mean, here we have the clear path, but I expect that from 2030 onwards, the ETS 2 will be its own pillar and not be longer part of the effort sharing regulation, and then facing the same problems. The market stability, the credits in the market stability reserve for the ETS2 become invalidated after 2030, and it's unclear what will be used there to stabilize the market. And I think it's very important to learn that every time you now give extra credits from the market stability reserve, that means extra emissions. Whereas when you give out certificates from a carbon removal certificate reserve, you remain with net zero, which in turn also provides you an, I would say, important bargaining chip for future climate policy, because you have always something you can cancel. And that means once you cancel your certificates you have in your reserve, you make a net negative emission. As long you have them in stock and plan to give them out, they will count as net zero. And these are so many dimensions and challenges that we also believe that a more like adaptive or discretionary intervention bundled under a carbon central bank might be an important instrument to think for about the integration of carbon dioxide removal in EU climate policy.
Thank you, Wilfried. Then I will ask at some point within a few next 30 seconds, people in the audience to also raise their little electronic hands, and I will then promote them to panelists. I would like to summarize a little bit some of the things that I've heard. First of all, I think that the market has been quite good at managing itself with the MSR and so on. Let's remember, at least in my mind, let's remember that hasn't always been the case when there was a lot of liquidity. And now it may not be the case when we get into very little liquidity. So I think one of the points that has been made by some is that in this disruptive moment or towards the middle 30s or so, that we may need something to do this. We have in the past introduced the MSR as a result of a crisis. We introduced the CBAM as part of a package. In this case, there is no crisis yet, but I think that it is the preemptive discussion, and I think something that takes time. And one of the reasons that it takes time is because the central bank name may be something that scares people, because, as Josh said, they perceive as a change in the treaty. And I think we should indeed focus on the functions and see how those functions can be taken in existing structure, as opposed to be preoccupied and seized by the new institutional arrangement, which may not probably be necessary. The management of the cap and the management of international connections. We remember just the Paris Agreement, and it is quite very much based on net zero, a global net zero. So there's a role there to be played in Article 29A. And finally, seeing Wilfried, the thing that you mentioned, the purchasing of carbon removals, whether that is a way of speeding up this while it takes time to change the regulatory framework, in another thing that we may want. What I wanted to say now is I would like to ask those of you that would like to react to some of the things that have been said by others. So if there's something that Otmar or Artur or anybody else want to react, first the panelists among themselves, so to speak. Then I have Helen Bray, who I will promote to a panelist, but I will ask her to hold her fire while I give the panelists the opportunity to react to each other. Anyone wants to react first? Are you perfectly happy with your interventions, and we can move on? Josh, you go ahead first. You go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you. I think two elements I take from the discussion. Liquidity and volatility is something we expect for the mid-30s, but may appear much earlier. Second point is much earlier, we will see the limits in the end game of the market stability reserve, as Luca was indicating. And third, we will see the issues of convergence with the ETS 1 and ETS 2. This brings me to three things that, in my view, will have to be developed for the next ETS review taking place, I don't know, 2026, 2027, 2028. And that could take place in the context of either the market stability reserve discussion and or the Article 29A discussion. And in that sense, I fully subscribe to what Wilfried was saying, and I think Otmar and Arthur were saying implicitly, that is that the number of issues coming on us are, we may want to deal with them on a rule-based system, but the number and the complexity of the issues is such that the discretionary system may become something that is unavoidable. That's not there for the immediate next ETS review, but may be there for the one after the next review. That's how I see things planning out. So if we would, in the next ETS review, already introduce the issues that will have to be dealt with in the review thereafter, that would be a very nice and intelligent way of preparing the future, testing out a number of issues, while we know that there will be liquidity or volatility questions coming up earlier rather than later, MSR coming to an end earlier rather than later, and the convergence between the ETS 1 and ETS 2, that may be the model for the system to align itself towards the reality of removals being brought into the ETS. Thanks.
Markets are unpredictable by definition. They move fast, Josh. I'm sorry, I think this is beginning to change on my screen, so I thought I had people in the right order, but I'm going to go to the order I have on my screen right now. Is Luca, Ingo, and then Artur. I'm sorry if I've got it wrong, but this is how it shows up on my screen. Go ahead, please.
Thanks. Just quickly on the volatility, also to respond and to as a segue to Josh's point, I think there's a clear possibility to design rule-based mechanism to mitigate volatility. However, to be quick, and I also completely agree with Josh, there will be aspects related to some of the decisions that need to be taken in the future that might require a combination of discretionary elements.
Ingo?
Just to follow up on the volatility aspect, I mean, clearly the MSR was set up to deal with the structural surplus and therefore to, let's say, create a price floor. It is not well equipped for, let's say, price volatility. I think that's as well not the intention of when it was established at that time. Rather, and we've seen that after COVID, it's actually more cyclical. So it creates more cyclicality in the prices on that side. That's maybe one thing that was missed in the review of the MSR. But I think the package Fit for 55 was so big and so challenging that there was clearly no time for looking into the MSR. And that's, again, the good thing of this call right now, to find solutions for the future well ahead of time.
Yeah, I think it's. I think very much the intention is to start the intellectual debate, make sure it gets on the agenda in the next political cycle. Artur?
I think that is also what I would underline, because I think from all the interventions I've heard, I think everybody sees problems coming up the horizon. And I think we should not allow ourselves to be in the same situation as we were when we had to really push the MSR through, because that was in a crisis moment. Of course, that helped in order to get political agreement very quickly, but I'm not sure whether that would happen also in the future, looking at the politics and where they are going at the present point in time. It's not going to go easier. And I think it's true that I think the MSR, if I look at it, really only deals with the surplus. And it was never being designed to deal either with volatility or with a situation where you run against the wall, which means you don't have any allowances, but you still need to see how do you take your economy forward and what's the path. This forward buying, and I think Wilfried was mentioning very nicely how a reserve could be created, which also ensures environmental integrity of the entire operation. So the big difference compared to a European investment bank definitely is in these discretionary elements. But I think what is important in the discussion is, because this is something myself and the other authors discussed in detail, is discretionary doesn't mean that we will have anarchy being allowed. And I think that's also true if you look at the European Central Bank. I think there is a clear mandate in terms of what is the objective of the bank that needs to be defined. And there need to be kind of corridors where the bank can work towards, and it can kind of express itself on where these corridors are going to be. So very much what we see these days, or over the last 24 months, when it comes to the management of interest rates, which is an important element. It is a discretionary element of a central bank. And in the same way, I would foresee a limited amount of discretionary elements for such a European central bank. But at the end of the day, I think what is very clear is that there needs to be environmental integrity. So that means you cannot issue something in order to reduce volatility if you don't have this gold standard in another bank account, which is a big bag of removals. And you cater for that big bag of removals, that it is going to be quasi-permanent. And I think that is what the role of the bank would be. My final point is, I don't think, and I've been thinking forward and backward on this, whether this would require a treaty change. I don't think so. It's still different from, I think, a European central bank. It's a carbon bank, and it's there to manage a particular market. So it's not about the entire economy, although it has vast economic implications if you get it wrong. So I think there is quite a difference. And to have this route on Article 29A, I think that is, something that should be explored by the colleagues in the Commission, because the central bank definitely would be an element to be able to manage this excessive prices, not to have this happening. And we all know how dangerous that would be to the entire system and to the entire field of climate policies. My last point is, yes, if everything goes well, things are going to really happening after 2030. But I think I would also share that there is a risk that this could also happen before 2030. So I think to address this in the next period, where the Commission will have to present adaptations for in terms of the post-2030 framework, that's exactly the time when this should be picked up. Thank you.
I'm tempted to make remarks, but I will pass it on directly to Otmar.
Thanks a lot. I have a quick comment and then a question to yours. So first of all, I would say the most daunting thing is how can we make sure that there is a really intertemporal budget constraint, right? So that's, and do we have a commitment for this intertemporal budget constraint? So as you know, so in Germany, we call this the black zero, the schwarze Null, and here we need a green zero. This is the grüne Null. And this is quite important, because the whole thing boils down, do we have really then an intertemporal budget constraint? And even if you think about overshoot and later net negative, So this is all about that. So this is a crucial thing. But here I have a question to yours. You mentioned basically to have a short-term solution for the liquidity issue, to allow for foreign credits, and also you said basically this could reinforce EU's industrial policy. This is an aspect which I find interesting. It would be great if you could elaborate a little bit more on this. What do you mean with that? Because at first glance, I would say if you allow for a lot of foreign credits, CDM likes, then you drive down the price. But whenever you drive down the price, so of course you might help some industries, but also you create a lot of stranded assets for other industries. And in that sense, I'm a little bit nervous about this, but probably I misunderstood you, and you have a very clever solution how to solve that problem.
I remember just you saying the word selective came in your intervention. I will go to Joss and then I'll go to Helen Bray because she's been waiting. But Joss, please go ahead.
Yes, exactly. I wanted to reinforce selective and also the check on the reliability and the trustworthiness of the credits. We learned our lesson through the CDM, but the point I wanted to make is that possibly by slamming the door 100% forever on CDM, we were for a radical solution. Now, we did that for the good reasons that we had to manage the oversupply, and that was in line with the development of the market stability reserve later on. But now we are, managing the whole situation, but we are managing the oversupply, not anything else. So that is what I wanted to manage. But the real point was on the basic function that you, Otmar, was indicating, that is the management of the cap that needs to be considered, and perhaps by a very selective way of those industrial credits where we have an element. Think about the green hydrogen investments that have to take place in our neighborhood. For the good reasons or the bad reasons that are currently happening in the geopolitical context, I think it's worth considering that. That's the point I wanted to make, but it could be a step in between today where we are and the mid-30s where the removal credits may come to the market in also selective and trustworthy batches, as you were rightly indicating. Thank you.
Yeah, two things. First of all, going back is never let a good crisis go to waste. But I think we have enough crisis around us these days that I don't think we need another one. So I think we have the opportunity and we should manage this one ahead. The other thing, Joss, that I would come back is we are in a little bit of a different world in many ways from the Kyoto world, where people could produce this stuff at absolutely no cost to themselves because there was an infinite amount and they had no corresponding adjustment. There was nothing to be done. I think there is going to be a much shorter supply of these things as people get more concerned about exporting their credits and doing corresponding adjustment. As such, the market may, again, is difficult to tell, but it maybe was based on global net zero, and the removals were clearly part of that discussion. And we didn't invent this. For those that were in Paris or observers there will remember that. Marcus and then Wilfred.
Yeah, thanks. And Helen, I think your intervention came in timely for mine because I wanted to make a few of those points, I think, as well. So I think, first of all, and I reiterate what I said before, I think there is no trust issue in the market, right? In a way, the intertemporal efficiency is guided by the cap trajectory. So knowing what the cap is going to be and knowing which instruments are there in order to stay within the cap will determine how the market is reacting in terms of price discovery and is reacting in terms of incentivizing new possibilities to reduce emissions. So if the framework, in a sense, is then adjusted to allow for additional certificates, offsets, allowances coming in, like removals, the market participants will react to this and will position themselves against this framework. So this is why I say I think it's quite important to know what we're talking about when we talk about the 2040 timeframe, the 2040 framework, and when we talk about the tools available to get to the cap trajectory required from this framework. if the market gets the clear signal that removals are a tool to use to stay within this framework, it will price itself adequately. I mean, we've seen this with quite a few tools that have been introduced in the past. I think we talked a lot about the MSR before. The MSR wasn't even operating in the market, was reacting to this because it reacted to the availability of such a tool to clear the market and to, in this case, remove the oversupply, right? I mean, this is the other way around now, but it's the same. Removals are more expensive than EUAs today, and they will continue being more expensive than EUAs today. But with the clear signal that removals are potentially going to be part or continue to take part in this market, the price pathway will adjust. And with this, we will get into kind of the discussion again about intertemporal efficiency, which will push the industrial sides probably to more ambitious pathways. Because what we should not forget, and I think this is the discussion we also had before, if we now allow market participants, especially industrials, to potentially or to kind of not 100% trust that the market is going to push them into a very painful territory, those industrials might not be incentivized today to actually do all those actions required in order to even get us into a territory where we can use removals, right? And I think this is a very, very it's a very crucial moment in time where I think market is there, market is trusted. We can create kind of a different framework again, where the market remains to be trusted, but where we kind of push the market towards the next level price-wise, which then incentivizes more investments in renewables, but also continuous investments on the industry side.
Marcus, thank you very much. Allow me to move to Wilfried.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important at this stage that we acknowledge that the carbon central bank is not the only option. There are other options for integration, and we should still discuss them in parallel. And the California cap and trade, there is from 27 onwards an increasing share firms have to cover by removals. That's an alternative. I think when we developed this idea, Ottmar and myself, we always had the current structure, how the EU ETS works and how is it set it up with this kind of top-down approach, had be very strong in mind. And for that reason, we came up with this carbon central bank idea, which we think fits better for EU climate policy. But that's not necessarily the case that this is a dominant option in all cases. The second point is on this intertemporal efficiency. That's exactly the idea of this procurement idea. So, I mean, if you would now open the market, it would be only possible to open it if you change the EU ETS directive, I think, to BECS and DACs, because they are covered by the CCS directive, which accounts for leakage if carbon gets away from your storage. And they are not yet in the price range that they could compete on the market. So we would not see this development, which we actually have in mind for under a procurement, where you could do, as Ottmar said, some kind of reverse auctioning scheme, and then these suppliers of carbon removal sell at a fixed price, which is much more attractive to them and likely higher than the current price in the EU ETS. Because from a perspective of a carbon central bank, they can make this argument that say, okay, we internalize this learning by doing effects, pushing here the cost down, and decide later how much we, in a sense, have lost or gained, because they decided which price they intervene. So that's a tool for them to deal with their kind of the budget implications of such a system. And just to respond to Helen, so for those companies who are waiting, I think for them, being part of such a procurement program would be much more attractive in terms of having down capital costs, having a fixed price they can sell it if they are now start operating on the market.
Indeed, Wilfried, I think that pushing this and creating a market for this where there is none right now, it's probably yet another way of looking at the role. Let me go to Michael Polly, and then I will come back to the panelists because we've got another 10 minutes, and I think I'd like to give a minute and a half or so to each of you to make your concluding remarks. Michael?
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone on the panel for the discussion. I want to relate to points that were made by Ottmar and by Markus. So I think, I mean, above all, the main question really also seems to me to be able to make a commitment to the long-term carbon budget, because once you open the ETS for international offsets or negative emissions, this can be a Pandora's box. So everyone could anticipate that once you take the first step, why don't you take the second step? Until, due to political pressure, you include every kind of crap, so to speak. And so I think really the main challenge is to find this balance between commitment and flexibility. And so ultimately, this is the question I think we need to ask to whatever institution it is. So how can we guarantee that the institution can preserve over time a certain degree of flexibility, of responsiveness, but over the long term really ensure that integrity is preserved? And probably it's not 100% integrity, probably it's just 90% integrity. But then again, this is the trade-off between flexibility and long-term commitment. And I think above all, this is the major question from my point of view. And I think this is ultimately what also should guide the design and the proposals with regard to the institutions or the functions of integration.
Michael, thank you. Good to see you again. Look, I'll go in reverse order if I can, and I'll give Otmar the last word in this, so he can also maybe summarize together with our tour. So Wilfried, Marcus, Luca, Joss, Ingo, and then we'll conclude with Otmar and our tour. So if you want to go, Wilfried, first, any last thoughts on this? I mean, this is, you know, the opening salvo. From our point of view, there will be other debates, but I'd like to, what do you take from this? Is there an appetite? Do you think that there's a case? Do you think this is going to fly? Or this is something going to be taken seriously to actually go into the real policy debate?
So first, from an academic perspective, we found it very interesting when we started working on this, that the idea of a carbon central bank is of course not new, but now with carbon dioxide removal, they can create their own currency. So with a physical underlying, to think that from an academic perspective, I find very interesting. But of course, there are, I mean, a lot of operational and political questions we have to address and think about and look into it to make it operational. So for example, as just raised, when we have this incoming, maybe low quality credits, should we put a ban on them, or is maybe the carbon central bank buying them and then deciding how much they are giving of those into the market? I mean, there's a price spread between those credits and the price in the EU ETS and the benefit they are making there. They can have some financial reserve for buying allowances back from the market if there is non-permanence issues. So that are certainly things we can think of the role of such an institution, and I say by purpose institution, not carbon central bank, to not overload it in these coming negotiations, because clear should be for any climate policy to have success, we have to look at how we get international connection, how we can make it work, and keep in mind what could the institution provide there. And I think also interesting than thinking about once you have such a carbon removal reserve, start thinking about, okay, that's a strategic bargaining chip, because once you put them not on the market but invalidate them, you can offer countries in exchange, for example, becoming part of the EU ETS or whatever, to invalidate those credits and turn them net negative. So I think there are many questions for us to address in the next years. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilfried. Marcus?
Yeah, I think what the debate has shown is that everyone agrees there is a need for renewables to somehow enter this system, right, in a way to keep us on a net zero or negative zero pathway. I think there is quite some disagreement on how this should or could be done. I think what I sense is that this is still a very it's a very interesting debate, and I think it's kind of a very it's a timely debate to be had, but at the same time we also agreed that probably don't even have the time to have this debate, right? Because all of this kind of financing needs to happen yesterday in order for those projects to kind of get the right incentives to start and kind of basically build their pipeline in order to generate those credits. So again, I would re-emphasize that we probably have already mechanisms in place in the current ETS framework that could be used for incentivizing and kickstarting that finance. I think first and foremost, I would mention the innovation fund, which could be widened with regards to the categories in terms of allowing financing for innovative projects. In this case, having a very dedicated focus on the renewable sector, which would be kind of a new category, which kind of takes those few renewable projects that have been successful in funding out of the CCS category, but can move them into a dedicated one that can or cannot go ahead with kind of additional funding requirements from the innovation fund. I mean, this again is a debate which will be controversial, but could take place. But by that you would avoid a time gap, I think, to get the required infrastructure in place in order to kickstart that finance, which I think we will certainly have with a carbon central bank discussion, because I think already judging from the group today, it will prove probably quite difficult to get this operational in a relatively short amount of time.
Thanks, Marcus. Luca?
Very briefly, yes, I believe that we definitely need to have this debate. Certainly, I agree with many of the panelists. This credibility of the carbon market is not an issue. Credibility of the current provision that we have in existing systems are not an issue. But many discussed the importance of intertemporal optimization. That very much depends on the horizon, and that depends on the horizon that the companies impose on themselves. And we wouldn't be here discussing climate change if the tragedy of the horizon was really an issue. So the horizon is not the one that we consider for the policy to be the one that should be projected on the company. Then there might be a need for something that maybe has the form of carbon central bank. And I would just conclude just saying that just as a central bank use communication strategies to shape expectation about the future monetary policies, maybe a carbon central bank or any form of more sophisticated rule-based, if not discretionary-based system can actually be useful to guide and provide stronger signal regarding the carbon price.
Yes, well, I was listening very carefully, and I'm very thankful for the debate. It was very, very helpful. We should have that more often. Now, I heard and picked up out of the debate that there is an expectation by all of us that carbon removals are going to be rewarded through the market. But I heard when DAX and BEX was mentioned that we need carbon prices perhaps 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, perhaps 5 times, as high as we currently have today. I think there is an issue we did not discuss, and that is the political acceptability of the carbon price. That is the argument that Michiel van Dessel was mentioning, and we should be very cautious to that political argument. I don't expect the politicization like Michael was describing it. I'm rather fearing that a too high carbon price, whatever that is decided, may, and that could be through volatility or liquidity crisis, needs to be dealt with. Hence, the cap management issue that Otmar was putting forward as a very important element may appear in a shorter term period and not only in the long-term period. So how to deal with that, preparing the long-term through short-term policy making, I think is an issue we should have prominently on our table between all of us. Thanks.
Ingo.
Well, thank you very much for initiating the discussion, which I think is timely. And so from that perspective, I think the important points from my perspective would be that possibly more important to discuss about the requirements and changes than if it's now a central bank or a bank or something different, because that clearly will create too many concerns around that. And then the other thing is pretty clear. I think we are facing radical change in the EU ETS, and with that, the MSR will not be sufficient. It was possibly the most important policy tool, but for the future challenges, it will not be enough. And then for the other point mentioned by Jos and as well before, I think latest with the IRR, we see that not only the stick is important, but we need as well a carrot, and therefore a combination of those two to achieve a decarbonization and not the often discussed deindustrialization. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Pleasure. Our keynote speakers now, I'll move to Otmar and Artur. In whatever order, Artur, I mean, if I am to be correct, then Artur, you go first, and then Otmar closes.
No, I think I leave it to Otmar because time is running.
Okay, Otmar, there you have it.
Then I can be very quick. So from my point of view, there are two fundamental issues. So at the very high level, you could say, okay, we have to price CO2 or greenhouse gases, and then we have to subsidize suppliers of carbon sinks. I think that's the fundamental thing. I don't believe that at the European scale we will find finance ministers to do this, to be honest. So I don't think this is the way to go. And therefore we have to find a way to do this within our current structure. And what Jos mentioned is, and this is something which I would like to elaborate, of course, the acceptability, political and social acceptability of carbon pricing is decisive. And I think of compensation for high carbon prices is one issue. The other one is, this is allowing for overshoot. And overshoot means you can increase the emissions now, which basically leads then to lower prices, but then you have to provide a net negative in the future. This is, from my point of view, in general possible, but then you need an institution which ensures the intertemporal budget constraint. Otherwise, this is not credible. So if you have such a credibility, so then you will even only to a very limited extent create standard assets in the market, because you might have with this overshoot a little bit of price decline, but this is not larger than the usual technological change. But if you cannot ensure the intertemporal budget constraint, so then you are at risk to create huge standard assets. So in that sense, I believe I'm not saying that exactly we need this European carbon central bank, but we need at least a functional equivalent to that.
Thank you, Otmar. I think you indeed almost took the words out of my mouth, because it's not a young debate in the sense of a young debate, because it's been around. Again, I said I remember Christian Pertuis kind of talking about this, and we had long discussions, and it kind of slowly disappeared with the price going up to 100. Now, Otmar, some of the papers have written by Otmar and Artur and others are bringing this into discussion. And why they're bringing discussion? Because there are real issues that have been addressed today. There's not hypothetical issues, there are real issues, and we should not get caught into the debate whether it's a central bank or not a central bank. I think that is a red herring. I think the important thing, and if we forget then just into treaty changes, then the whole thing is forget it. I think we should focus on what the issues and the functions that need to be fulfilled, and how we do that, because we are in a different world from every point of view, internationally, inside the EU, the stage of decarbonization. There's a lot of new issues that we were not facing before. We're facing a surplus of liquidity. Now we're going to be facing a paucity of liquidity as we get into the 30s. So these are real things. from our point, we hope that we contributed a little bit to this debate. I'm very grateful to all of you very busy and people that I've known for many years. The commitment that we have, we will continue. You may know that together with Clemens Fust at IFO, we have convened a small group to think a little bit about issues on the that should be brought to the attention of the next political cycle in Europe. This is a game that is played in Brussels right now. Everybody has one of these, and we are a think tank. We have to have one of these, fortunately. But we will continue to be in touch. Hope that you will join us for further debates. Again, both at the roundtable, but also contributing to the intellectual debate. I think this debate will be kickstarted very strongly by the papers that we have put together today. And again, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for those that have joined us. And we'll probably see you sometime. I assume some of this debate will also take place in international fora at the COP. It may be in a different frame, in a different context, but the removals is clearly on the agenda of COP28. That is without any say. Again, all of you, thank you, and we'll see you soon. Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Appreciate your presence, Otmar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.